The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Pinewood Community Center as General Danica Quelmont stood rigid in the doorway, her steel-gray eyes scanning the room with military precision. For 20 years, not a single smile had crossed her weathered face, not since the day that changed everything and froze her heart solid. The local veterans knew her reputation. The ice general, they whispered, a woman carved from stone who'd forgotten how to feel anything but duty and discipline. Then, a maintenance worker with paint-stained hands and a gentle laugh looked up from fixing a broken radiator. Mike Doran, single father and former Army medic, had no idea he was about to shatter 2 decades of carefully built walls with nothing more than a ridiculous joke about stubborn heating systems. What happened next would leave witnesses speechless because when an ice-cold general finally breaks, the sound of genuine laughter can shake the very foundations of everyone who thought they knew her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. General Danica Quelmont's boots clicked against the polished marble floors of the Oak Ridge Municipal Building with the precision of a metronome. At 45, she commanded respect wherever she went, not through raised voices or dramatic gestures, but through an aura of absolute control that seemed to freeze the air around her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun that hadn't shifted a millimeter in 20 years, and her charcoal gray suit fit her tall frame like armor. She wore no jewelry except for the silver watch that had belonged to her father, and her face remained a mask of professional neutrality that colleagues had long since stopped trying to crack. The meeting she'd just concluded with the city council regarding veteran services had gone exactly as expected. Numbers discussed, budgets approved, handshakes exchanged with the mechanical efficiency of a well-oiled machine. No one had attempted small talk. No one had smiled in her direction expecting one in return. They all knew better by now. General Quelmont didn't do warmth, didn't do casual conversation, and certainly didn't waste time on pleasantries that served no strategic purpose. 20 years ago, everything had been different. Danica could barely remember the woman she'd been before that October morning when her convoy hit the IDD outside Kandahar. Before she'd held Private Rodriguez in her arms as he died, whispering about the daughter he'd never see grow up. Before she'd spent 3 months in a military hospital, not from physical wounds that healed, but from the kind of damage that burrows deep into your soul and builds walls so high that even you forget what's behind them. The Army had promoted her afterward, recognizing her strategic brilliance and unwavering dedication. What they hadn't realized was that promotion came at the cost of everything that made her human. She'd climbed the ranks with methodical precision, earning respect and fear in equal measure, but never again allowing herself the luxury of feeling anything that might compromise her judgment. Emotions were weaknesses, connections were vulnerabilities, and laughter was a sound she'd systematically erased from her vocabulary. Her apartment reflected this philosophy perfectly. Located in the prestigious Hillcrest Tower, it was all clean. Lines and neutral colors, furniture chosen for function rather than comfort. No photographs cluttered the surfaces, no plants softened the corners, no books revealed personal interests. Even her refrigerator was a study in efficient minimalism, stocked with pre-planned meals that could be prepared and consumed without thought. She lived like a ghost haunting her own life, going through the motions of existence without ever truly inhabiting it. The isolation hadn't happened overnight. In the early years after her return, well-meaning friends and fellow officers had tried to reach her. Invitations to dinners, attempts at setting her up on dates, casual offers to grab coffee after work. But Danica had perfected the art of polite deflection, accepting just enough social obligations to maintain professional relationships, while ensuring that no one ever got close enough to matter. Eventually, they'd stopped trying, and she'd told herself it was exactly what she wanted. Work became her entire world. She threw herself into every assignment with an intensity that impressed superiors and intimidated subordinates. Her reports were flawless, her strategic assessments legendary, her ability to make difficult decisions without emotional interference unparalleled. She'd become exactly what the military needed, a perfectly efficient machine for processing complex problems and delivering results. The fact that this efficiency came at the cost of her humanity was simply the price of excellence. Even after transitioning to civilian work as a consultant for veteran affairs, nothing changed. She approached each case file, each budget meeting, each policy review with the same methodical precision that had served her in the military. Veterans respected her because she got things done. Politicians feared her because she couldn't be manipulated. And administrators appreciated her because she never caused drama or required emotional maintenance. She was, by every professional measure, a tremendous success. But success, Danica had learned, was a cold companion. It didn't keep you warm at night, didn't laugh at your jokes because you'd forgotten how to make them, didn't offer comfort when the nightmares came calling at 3 in the morning. Success was reliable and predictable, which made it infinitely preferable to the messy unpredictability of human connection. At least, that's what she told herself every morning when she looked in the mirror and saw a stranger wearing her face. The people who worked with her had developed their own language around her presence. The generals reviewing the budget meant everyone should work quietly and efficiently. The general wants to see you meant someone was either getting promoted or transferred, because she only gave direct feedback when action was required. The general seemed pleased was the highest compliment anyone could expect, because actual pleasure never registered on her features. She'd become a legend in veteran services circles, not for her warmth or inspirational leadership, but for her ability to navigate bureaucracy and secure resources that other advocates could only dream of accessing. Her reputation preceded her into every room, every meeting, every professional encounter. People adjusted their behavior around her, like adjusting the temperature for optimal efficiency. They spoke in measured tones, stuck to facts and figures, avoided anything that might be construed as personal or emotional. It was exactly the environment she'd cultivated, a protective bubble of professional distance that kept the world at arm's length. What no one knew, what Danica herself had almost forgotten, was that beneath 20 years of carefully constructed armor lived the ghost of a woman who had once laughed until her sides hurt, who had told ridiculous stories that made her entire platoon crack up during long deployments, who had danced badly to terrible music and hadn't cared who was watching. That woman had died in the desert 20 years ago, buried under the weight of responsibility and grief and a determination never to be vulnerable again. As she walked through the municipal building that gray October afternoon, past offices filled with people who would never dream of approaching her with anything resembling familiarity, Danica Quelmont had no idea that her perfectly ordered world was about to collide with a maintenance worker's gentle humor and shatter into pieces she'd spend the rest of her life gratefully trying to put back together. The Pinewood Community Center, set on the corner of Maple and 3rd Street like a beacon of organized chaos. Built in the 1960s and renovated twice since then, it managed to be both welcoming and slightly shabby in the way that all truly loved community spaces eventually became. The main hall buzzed with activity most afternoons, hosting everything from senior citizens' book clubs to youth basketball practice, but on this particular Tuesday, it was serving as the venue for the monthly Veterans Services Coordination meeting. Danica arrived exactly 15 minutes early, as was her custom. Punctuality was a form of respect, and respect was one of the few currencies she still dealt in. She'd reviewed the agenda 3 times, prepared her notes with military precision, and anticipated every possible question that might arise during the discussion of the new mental health initiative. What she hadn't anticipated was walking into a building where the heating system had chosen that morning to stage a complete rebellion. The receptionist A cheerful woman named Kyla Verrill, who had worked at the center for over a decade, looked up with the apologetic expression of someone delivering bad news. "General Quelmont, I'm so sorry. We're having some issues with the heating system. The meeting room is freezing, and we've got a maintenance worker trying to sort it out, but he says it might take a while." Danica nodded curtly, already calculating alternative solutions. "Has anyone contacted the other attendees about a possible venue change?" "That's just it," Kyla continued, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "Everyone's already confirmed they're coming, and this was the only space available today that could accommodate the group. Mike, our maintenance guy, thinks he can get it working, but he's asked for maybe another 30 minutes. The sound of clanging pipes and muttered commentary drifted from down the hallway, punctuated by what sounded like someone having a very patient conversation with an inanimate object. Danica followed the sound with the methodical curiosity of someone accustomed to investigating problems firsthand. She found herself outside a utility room where a pair of work boots protruded from beneath a massive, ancient-looking boiler that seemed to be staging its own personal protest. "Come on, Bertha," a voice was saying from somewhere inside the mechanical. "Innards, you've been working fine for 15 years. Don't start throwing tantrums now just because it's getting cold outside. That's literally your job." The boots shuffled, and a torso emerged, followed by a man who looked to be in his early 40s with graying brown hair, and the kind of face that suggested he smiled frequently. His work shirt was stained with what appeared to be a combination of grease, dust, and something that might have been coffee from several days ago. When he saw Danica standing in the doorway, he scrambled to his feet with the quick reflexes of someone accustomed to being caught in undignified positions, preparing and narrating. "This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Oh, sorry about that," he said, wiping his hands on a rag that didn't look particularly clean. "You must be here for the veterans meeting. I'm Mike Doran, and I'm afraid Bertha here is being a bit of a diva today." He gestured toward the boiler with the affection usually reserved for difficult relatives. Danica found herself studying this Mike Doran with the analytical attention she typically reserved for strategic assessments. He was tall but not imposing, with the lean build of someone who stayed in shape through physical work rather than gym memberships. His hands were calloused and competent looking, and there was something about his posture that suggested military background, though he carried himself with a relaxed ease that spoke of successful transition to civilian life. "General Quelmont." She introduced herself with characteristic brevity. "How long until the heating is operational?" Mike's eyes lit up with recognition, though not the usual mix of intimidation and deference she was accustomed to seeing. "The General Quelmont? The one who got the VA to approve funding for the transitional housing program. That was brilliant work. I've got 3 guys in my building who are there because of that initiative." For a moment, Danica was caught off guard by the genuine appreciation in his voice. Most people acknowledged her professional accomplishments with the kind of respect reserved for necessary but intimidating authority figures. Mike spoke as if she'd personally done something that mattered to him, which was both accurate and completely beside the point. "The heating," she prompted, steering the conversation back to practical matters. "Right, sorry." Mike grinned and turned back to the boiler. "Bertha's got a clogged filter, and what I suspect is a case of wounded pride. The building manager has been meaning to upgrade this system for about 5 years. But you know how it is with community center budgets. She keeps working, so she keeps getting patched instead of replaced." He disappeared back under the boiler, his voice emerging muffled but cheerful. "The good news is, I think I've got her figured out. The bad news is, she's going to make me work for it. This old girl's got personality, which is more than you can say for those modern systems that just hum along quietly doing their job. Mechanical systems don't have personalities. Danica stated with the certainty of someone who dealt in facts rather than fanciful interpretations. "Oh, but they do." Mike's voice floated back, accompanied by the sound of tools against metal. "Bertha here, for instance, she's got opinions. She doesn't like sudden temperature changes. She gets cranky when people forget to change her filters. And she absolutely refuses to work efficiently when the city inspector comes around. Classic passive-aggressive behavior." Despite herself, Danica found her attention caught by his commentary. She'd worked with plenty of maintenance personnel over the years, and they typically fell into two categories: the ones who apologized extensively for any inconvenience, and the ones who grumbled about unrealistic expectations and insufficient budgets. Mike seemed to fall into neither category, treating his work with a combination of professional competence and genuine affection that was oddly compelling. "There we go," he announced, sliding out from under the boiler with a satisfied expression. "I think we've reached an understanding. Bertha's agreed to behave herself for the rest of the day, but she wants me to promise that we'll schedule her a proper tune-up next month." The boiler, as if responding to his words, rumbled to life with what sounded distinctly like a sigh of resignation. Almost immediately, Danica could feel the first hints of warmth beginning to circulate through the building. "Excellent," she said, already turning to return to the meeting room. "Thank you for your efficiency." "Wait," Mike called after her, causing her to pause in the doorway. "I know this might be presumptuous, but I've got a thermos of coffee here. That's actually pretty decent, and you look like someone who could use some warming up before that meeting starts." Danica turned back, her professional autopilot already formulating a polite decline. She didn't drink coffee with maintenance workers, didn't engage in casual conversation with people she'd likely never see again, and certainly didn't accept personal favors that might create the impression of informal social obligations. But something about Mike's expression stopped her. It wasn't the eager-to-please attitude she was used to encountering, nor was it the careful deference that most people showed her. He was simply offering coffee to someone who looked cold, with the same uncomplicated kindness he'd shown to the temperamental boiler. "I appreciate the offer," she heard herself saying, "but I need to review my notes before the meeting begins." Mike nodded with easy acceptance, already turning back to his tools. "Of course. Well, if Bertha starts acting up again during your meeting, just give a shout. We've got an understanding now, but she's been known to change her mind when there's an audience." As Danica walked back toward the meeting room, she found herself thinking about the interaction with an attention to detail that seemed disproportionate to its significance. There had been something different about Mike Doran's approach, something that had momentarily disrupted the careful equilibrium she'd maintained for 20 years. It was probably nothing more than the novelty of encountering someone who treated broken heating systems like temperamental friends, but it lingered in her mind with unexpected persistence. The meeting, when it finally began, proceeded with its usual efficiency, but Danica found her attention occasionally drifting to the sound of Mike's tools echoing through the building as he worked on some other repair project. She told herself it was simply awareness of potential disruptions, but something about the cheerful competence of those sounds suggested otherwise. The following Tuesday brought Danica back to Pinewood Community Center for the monthly budget review meeting, though she told herself the consistency of venue was simply a matter of practical convenience. The building's heating system was functioning perfectly, she noted with professional satisfaction, and the meeting proceeded with its usual efficiency. What she hadn't expected was to encounter Mike Doran again, this time replacing fluorescent bulbs in the main hallway with the same methodical care he'd shown the temperamental boiler. "General," he greeted her with a nod and a smile that seemed genuinely pleased rather than professionally obligatory. "Good to see you again. Bertha's been behaving herself since our last conversation. I think she was just showing off for someone important." Danica paused in her stride, noting that once again, Mike's approach contained none of the careful deference she was accustomed to receiving. He spoke to her as if she were simply another person, rather than a reputation preceded by whispered warnings and professional legends. It was both unexpected and oddly refreshing. "The heating system is functioning adequately," she confirmed, then found herself adding, "The repairs appear to have been effective." "That's the thing about old systems," Mike replied, carefully positioning a new bulb in its fixture. "They just need someone to pay attention to what they're actually telling you, instead of trying to force them to work the way you think they should work." Something about his phrasing caught Danica's attention, though she couldn't quite identify why. She'd built her entire career on understanding systems, analyzing their components, and optimizing their performance. But Mike's approach suggested a different kind of understanding, one based on observation and adaptation rather than control and correction. Over the next several weeks, their paths crossed with increasing frequency. Danica found herself arriving at the community center slightly earlier than necessary, though she told herself this was simply good time management. Mike seemed to be everywhere, fixing a leaky faucet here, adjusting a stubborn door there, always with the same combination of professional competence and gentle humor that had first caught her attention. She learned about him in fragments, small pieces of information that accumulated like evidence in a case file. He was a veteran, Army medic discharged 8 years ago after an injury that ended his military career, but left him with skills perfectly suited to keeping aging community infrastructure functioning. He lived alone in a small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, had a daughter named Celia who visited every other weekend, and approached every repair job as if it were a conversation with an old friend who just needed a little patience and understanding. The revelation about his daughter came during their fourth encounter, when Danica arrived to find Mike installing new locks on the center's storage rooms, while humming what sounded like a children's song under his breath. "My daughter's been teaching me the latest playground hits," he explained with an embarrassed grin when he noticed Danica's questioning look. "Apparently, I'm required to know all the words to something called The Wheels on the Bus for when she visits next weekend." Danica nodded with professional acknowledgement, though something about his tone suggested depths of affection and commitment that she recognized from her own military service. The willingness to endure personal discomfort for the sake of someone who mattered. The careful attention to details that others might consider insignificant. The quiet pride that came from successfully meeting responsibilities that no one else fully understood. "How old is your daughter?" she heard herself asking, though personal questions weren't typically part of her professional repertoire. 8, Mike replied, his face lighting up with unmistakable parental pride. "Smart as a whip, and twice as stubborn. She's got opinions about everything from the best way to make pancakes to why adults don't understand that. Playground equipment has specific rules that need to be followed exactly." For reasons she couldn't quite explain, Danica found herself listening to Mike's stories about his daughter with an attention that went beyond polite interest. His descriptions painted a picture of a man who had successfully navigated the transition from military service to civilian parenthood, maintaining his sense of purpose while adapting to completely different challenges and responsibilities. Their conversations began to extend beyond basic pleasantries, though they remained firmly within the bounds of professional acquaintance. Mike would update her on the building's various mechanical personalities, and she would occasionally share observations about the community center's operational efficiency. Nothing personal, nothing that crossed the carefully maintained boundaries of her professional demeanor, but somehow more substantial than the surface-level interactions that comprised most of her social contact. It was during the 5th week of these encounters that Danica made a discovery that shifted her understanding of Mike Doran, from interesting maintenance worker to someone worth paying closer attention to. She'd arrived early for a particularly important meeting with state funding, representatives and found Mike working on what appeared to be a complex electrical problem in the main conference room. "We should be good to go in about 10 minutes," he assured her, carefully threading new wiring through the ceiling panels. The previous repair job was done by someone who apparently believed that electrical tape could solve any problem if you used enough of it. As Danica watched him work, she noticed something that her military training immediately recognized. Mike's approach to problem solving followed the same systematic methodology she'd learned in officer training. Assess the situation completely. Before taking action, identify all contributing factors. Develop a comprehensive solution rather than a quick fix, and test the results thoroughly before declaring success. "You're working through a diagnostic protocol," she observed, recognizing the pattern even though she'd never seen it applied to electrical systems. Mike paused in his work and looked at her with surprise that quickly shifted to understanding. "Army medic training," he confirmed. "Turns out the same approach that works for treating field injuries works pretty well for troubleshooting broken infrastructure. Identify the real problem instead of just treating symptoms. Understand how all the systems connect to each other and always have a backup plan." For the first time in 20 years, Danica felt a flicker of recognition that had nothing to do with professional acknowledgement, everything to do with meeting someone who understood the fundamental principles that had shaped her own approach to life. The realization was both unexpected and slightly unsettling, creating a crack in the carefully maintained wall she'd built around personal connection. "That's an effective methodology," she said carefully, testing the waters of slightly more personal conversation. "It works for most things," Mike agreed, returning to his wiring with practiced efficiency. "Buildings, people, relationships, they're all just systems that need the right kind of attention to function properly. The trick is figuring out what kind of attention each one actually needs instead of applying the same solution to every problem." The insight lingered in Danica's mind long after the meeting had concluded successfully and she'd returned to her apartment. Mike's casual observation about understanding what different systems actually needed had touched something she'd been avoiding, thinking about for years. She'd become an expert at analyzing and optimizing external systems, while completely ignoring the internal ones that had been sending distress signals for the better part of 2 decades. That night, for the first time in years, Danica found herself genuinely curious about another person's perspective. Not their professional qualifications or strategic value, but their actual thoughts and experiences. Mike Doran had somehow managed to maintain his humanity while successfully transitioning from military service to civilian life, and she couldn't help wondering how he'd accomplished something that had seemed impossible to her. The following Tuesday, when she arrived at the community center and found Mike replacing a broken window in the main hallway, Danica did something that surprised both of them. Instead of simply nodding and proceeding to her meeting, she stopped and asked, "How do you maintain connection to people without compromising your ability to function professionally?" Mike looked up from his work with the expression of someone who'd been asked a question he hadn't expected, but found genuinely interesting. "You mean, how do you care about people without letting it paralyze you when things go wrong?" The accuracy of his interpretation was both startling and somehow comforting. "Yes," Danica confirmed, realizing she'd been carrying that question for longer than she'd been willing to admit. Mike set down his tools and considered his answer with the same careful attention he brought to diagnostic problems. "I guess I figured out that shutting down completely was just another way of being paralyzed. The choice isn't between caring and not caring. It's between caring in a way that helps people and caring in a way that helps nobody." 3 weeks later, the Pinewood Community Center was hosting its annual Veteran Appreciation Dinner, an event that Danica had somehow found herself agreeing to attend despite her usual policy of avoiding social gatherings that served no strategic purpose. She told herself it was professional networking, an opportunity to connect with community leaders and assess the effectiveness of recently implemented programs. The fact that Mike had mentioned he'd be working the event, ensuring that the building's aging infrastructure could handle the increased capacity, was entirely coincidental. The evening had proceeded exactly as Danica had anticipated. Polite conversations about budget allocations, carefully measured discussions about program effectiveness, and the kind of surface-level social interaction that allowed her to fulfill professional obligations without venturing into dangerous territory. She'd positioned herself near the back of the room, close enough to participate when necessary, but far enough from the main crowd to maintain her preferred level of detachment. The dinner had reached the point where community leaders were sharing brief remarks about veteran services when disaster struck in the form of the building's notoriously temperamental sound system. What had started as minor feedback during the opening remarks escalated into a full electronic rebellion that rendered the microphone completely useless. Just as the mayor was beginning his keynote address, Danica watched with professional detachment as various officials huddled around the sound equipment, pressing buttons and adjusting dials with the desperate enthusiasm of people who had no idea what they were doing. The mayor, a well-meaning man named Jorvan Stradel, who was better at politics than public speaking under the best of circumstances, was beginning to show signs of panic as his carefully prepared remarks became increasingly inaudible to the 100+ attendees. That's when Mike appeared from the back of the room, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who'd encountered this particular problem before. He made his way to the sound system with professional purpose, ignoring the cluster of officials who were still pushing random buttons in hopes of stumbling onto a solution. "Excuse me, Mayor Stradel," Mike said politely, his voice carrying clearly across the room despite the lack of amplification. "I think I can get this working, but it's going to require some creative problem solving. What followed was 5 minutes of Mike working on the sound system while providing running commentary that gradually transformed a potentially embarrassing situation into cocaine, something approaching entertainment. He diagnosed the problem out loud, explaining to the increasingly amused audience that the microphone system was suffering from what he called performance anxiety, brought on by being asked to work harder than usual. "The thing about old sound systems," Mike announced to the room while carefully adjusting connections, "is that they're like that one relative everyone has who works fine in small groups but gets overwhelmed at big family gatherings." A few people in the audience chuckled, and Mike continued his mechanical therapy session while working. This particular system apparently needs some encouragement and possibly a pep talk about how important tonight's event is. More laughter rippled through the room as Mike addressed the microphone directly. "Come on now. We've got important people here tonight who need to hear about important things. This is not the time to be temperamental." As if responding to his encouragement, the sound system crackled to life with a squawk that made everyone jump, followed by perfect clarity. Mike tested the microphone by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe our electronic friend has decided to cooperate," which earned him a round of applause that was both grateful and genuinely amused. But Mike wasn't finished. As he handed the microphone back to Mayor Stradel, he added with perfect timing, "Though I should warn everyone that this system has been known to develop opinions about speech content. If the microphone starts cutting out during anyone's remarks, it's probably just editorial feedback." The room erupted in laughter, including several people who Danica recognized as typically serious-minded community leaders. Even Mayor Stradel was grinning as he took the microphone and said, "Well, I guess I'd better make sure my speech is worth listening to." From her position near the back of the room, Danica felt something strange happening in her chest, a sensation she couldn't immediately identify. Mike's combination of competent problem-solving and gentle humor had transformed what could have been an awkward disaster into a moment of genuine community connection. He'd made everyone feel like they were in on the joke rather than victims of technical difficulties, but it was what happened next that changed everything. As the evening continued and Mike made his way back through the crowd, he passed near Danica's table just as someone knocked over a water glass, sending ice cubes skittering across the floor. Without thinking, Mike immediately knelt to help clean up the mess, but one particularly rebellious ice cube escaped and slid directly under his feet as he stood up. What followed was a moment of perfect physical comedy as Mike performed an elaborate dance to avoid slipping, arms windmilling dramatically as he fought to maintain his balance while simultaneously trying to avoid stepping on the elderly woman seated nearby. He managed to stay upright, but just barely, ending up in a pose that looked like a cross between a yoga stance and a touchdown celebration. And that, Mike announced to the immediate vicinity with theatrical dignity, is why they don't let maintenance workers participate in ballroom dancing competitions. The comment was absurd enough and delivered with such perfect timing that something inside Danica simply cracked. Before she could stop herself, before she could engage the careful control mechanisms that had protected her for 20 years, she laughed out, not a polite chuckle or a professional acknowledgement of humor, but an actual laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest, bubbling up with a force that surprised everyone within hearing distance, including herself. It was rusty and unfamiliar, like a voice she hadn't used in so long she'd forgotten she possessed it, but it was unmistakably genuine. The sound cut through the ambient dinner conversation like a bell, causing several people at nearby tables to turn and look with expressions of surprise and curiosity. Mike's face lit up with a grin that suggested he'd just witnessed something remarkable, though he was clearly trying not to make a big deal about it. Danica's hand flew to her mouth, as if to contain the sound that had already escaped, her eyes wide with something that might have been panic or wonder or both. 20 years of carefully maintained emotional control had just cracked wide open because of an ice cube and a maintenance worker's ridiculous commentary, and she had no idea how to process what had just happened. For a moment, the small group around their table existed in a bubble of suspended time, everyone recognizing that they'd witnessed something significant without fully understanding what it meant. Mike, displaying the same gentle intuition he'd shown with temperamental mechanical systems, simply smiled and said quietly, "Sometimes the best moments are the ones that catch us completely off guard." The conversation gradually resumed around them, but Danica remained frozen in place, her hand still pressed to her mouth as if the laugh might try to escape again. She'd spent 2 decades building walls that were supposed to be impenetrable, and Mike Doran had somehow found a way through them with nothing more than genuine kindness and perfectly timed physical comedy. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Mike appeared at Danica's table one more time, his work shirt now slightly damp from cleaning duties, but his expression warm and somehow proud. "Thank you for letting that happen," he said quietly, his words clearly meant for her alone. "I had a feeling you had that laugh in there somewhere. It's a good one." Danica looked up at him, still processing the strange new sensation of having laughed for the first time in 20 years, and realized that Mike Doran had just fundamentally altered something she'd thought was permanently broken. She didn't know what to do with that information, but for the first time in decades, she found herself curious about what might happen next. The morning after the Veteran Appreciation Dinner, Danica sat in her pristine apartment staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror and trying to understand what had happened to her. The laugh had echoed in her mind all night, unfamiliar and startling, like hearing a sound from a room she'd thought was permanently sealed off. She'd built her entire adult life around the principle that emotional control was the foundation of professional effectiveness, and Mike Doran had managed to crack that foundation with an ice cube in a moment of perfectly timed absurdity. She arrived at her office that morning with her usual punctuality, but her assistant, Elmira Fenwick, immediately noticed something different. "You look," Elmira said carefully, studying Danica's face with the analytical attention of someone who'd worked with her for 5 years. "I'm not sure how to put this, but you look lighter somehow." Danica's first instinct was to deflect with professional efficiency, but she found herself pausing to consider the observation. Did she feel lighter? She wasn't entirely sure what that would mean, but something had definitely shifted in the 12 hours since she'd laughed at Mike's ridiculous Ice Cube ballet. The veteran appreciation dinner was more successful than anticipated, she said finally, which was both true and completely inadequate to explain the earthquake that had occurred in her carefully ordered emotional landscape the day preceded, with its usual schedule of meetings and administrative tasks. But Danica found her attention occasionally drifting to questions she hadn't considered in years. How had Mike maintained his sense of humor while transitioning from military service to civilian life? What enabled him to find genuine amusement in everyday situations without compromising his professional effectiveness? And perhaps most puzzling of all, how had he recognized something in her that she'd forgotten existed? By Thursday, curiosity had evolved into something approaching determination. When she arrived at the Pinewood Community Center for the monthly coordination meeting, she came prepared with questions that went beyond routine professional interaction. She found Mike in his usual habitat, working on what appeared to be a comprehensive maintenance project involving the center's aging electrical system. The dinner was well executed, she said, approaching his work area with characteristic directness. Your intervention with the sound system was particularly effective. Mike looked up from a tangle of wires with the pleased expression of someone receiving unexpected positive feedback. Thanks. I've had a lot of practice with that particular system's moods. It likes to test people, but it usually comes around if you treat it with respect. About what happened afterward, Danica continued, forcing herself to address the subject that had been occupying her thoughts for the past 3 days. The laughter incident. Ah, Mike said, setting down his tools and giving her his full attention. Are you okay with that having happened? You looked pretty surprised. The question was asked with genuine concern rather than curiosity, and Danica found herself appreciating his directness. I'm trying to understand the mechanism, she said carefully. I haven't experienced involuntary emotional response in 20 years. I need to know how it happened. Mike studied her face for a moment, clearly recognizing that this was a serious conversation, disguised as a technical inquiry. Can I ask you something? When you say involuntary emotional response, do you mean you haven't felt things, or you haven't let yourself express them? The distinction was one Danica hadn't considered, and it stopped her short. Had she truly been emotionless for 20 years, or had she simply become expert at suppression? The answer, when she was honest with herself, was more complicated than she'd been willing to acknowledge. Both, she admitted finally. The expression was controlled, but the experience became increasingly infrequent over time. Mike nodded with the understanding of someone who'd encountered similar challenges. Military training is really good at teaching you to compartmentalize emotions for operational effectiveness. The problem is, it's not so good at teaching you how to uncompartmentalize them when the operation is over. You experienced similar difficulties? Danica asked, recognizing the fellow veteran's insight. Oh, absolutely, Mike confirmed. Took me about 3 years after discharge to figure out that emotional shutdown wasn't a sustainable long-term strategy for civilian life. My daughter was a big part of that learning process. Kids don't really accept emotional unavailability as a reasonable adult response. The mention of his daughter reminded Danica of questions she'd been considering about Mike's successful transition. How did you maintain professional effectiveness while re-engaging emotionally? Trial and error mostly, Mike said with a rueful smile. But I think the key was realizing that emotional engagement actually improves professional effectiveness, rather than compromising it. When you care about the outcome, you pay more attention to details, you're more motivated to find creative solutions, and you build better relationships with the people you're working with. Danica considered this perspective, comparing it to her own experience of emotional withdrawal as a protective mechanism. That contradicts established military doctrine about objective decision-making. Does it though? Mike asked, returning to his wiring work while continuing the conversation. Or does military doctrine assume that emotional engagement means being ruled by emotions instead of being informed by them? There's a difference between letting feelings make your decisions and letting them provide data for better decisions. The distinction was subtle but significant, and Danica found herself genuinely intrigued by Mike's analysis. She'd spent 20 years treating emotions as security vulnerabilities rather than information sources, assuming that feeling meant losing control rather than gaining insight. Your laughter last night, Mike continued, carefully connecting two sets of wires. That wasn't a loss of control. That was your brain recognizing something genuinely funny and responding appropriately. It's actually a sign of healthy cognitive function, not emotional dysfunction. It felt like dysfunction, Danica admitted. 20 years of controlled response patterns, interrupted by ice cubes and physical comedy. Mike's grin was visible even from his position working inside the electrical panel. Sometimes the best breakthroughs happen when we're not trying to have them. Your brain has been storing up 20 years' worth of suppressed responses. One genuine moment of amusement was probably just the beginning. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. If Mike was right, if her emotional landscape hadn't been permanently flattened, but simply temporarily frozen, then the implications for her future were significantly more complex than she'd been prepared to consider. Hypothetically, she said carefully, if someone wanted to continue this process of emotional re-engagement, what would you recommend as an effective approach? Mike emerged from the electrical panel with an expression that suggested he was taking the question seriously. Start small. Pay attention to things that generate genuine interest or curiosity, even if they seem unimportant. Practice expressing preferences about things that don't have strategic significance. And maybe spend time around people who model healthy emotional expression without making it feel like a performance requirement. People like you, Danica observed, recognizing the pattern he was describing. People like both of us, actually, Mike corrected gently. You laughed last night because you recognized something genuinely amusing. That capacity was already there. It just needed the right circumstances to express itself safely. As Danica walked back to the meeting room, she found herself processing Mike's insights with the same analytical attention she brought to strategic planning. Emotional re-engagement as a systematic process rather than a random occurrence. The idea that her laughter hadn't been a malfunction but a sign of returning function. The possibility that 20 years of emotional winter might be ending not through dramatic upheaval but through small, careful moments of genuine connection. For the first time in decades, Danica Quelmont found herself genuinely curious about her own future, wondering what other aspects of herself might still be waiting to be rediscovered. And for the first time since that October morning in Kandahar, she began to suspect that the woman she'd been before the walls went up might not be as permanently lost as she'd convinced herself to believe. Over the following 6 weeks, Danica found herself establishing new patterns that would have been unthinkable just 2 months earlier. Her Tuesday and Thursday visits to Pinewood Community Center extended beyond the necessary meeting times, evolving into what she told herself were informal operational assessments, but which increasingly resembled actual conversations with Mike about topics that had nothing to do with veteran services or building maintenance. She learned that Mike approached every repair project as if it were a puzzle worth solving rather than simply a problem requiring elimination. Watching him work became unexpectedly fascinating as he demonstrated the same systematic diagnostic methodology she recognized from military training, but applied with a patience and creativity that suggested years of practice finding solutions with limited resources. The trick with old buildings, Mike explained during one of their extended conversations, is understanding that they weren't designed to last forever, but they were designed to be fixable. Modern systems are more efficient, but when they break, You usually have to replace entire components. These older systems, you can keep them running indefinitely if you understand how all the pieces connect to each other. Danica found herself genuinely interested in his explanations, not because building maintenance had suddenly become professionally relevant, but because Mike's approach to problem-solving revealed a philosophy that extended far beyond mechanical systems. He treated everything he encountered with a combination of respect, curiosity, and gentle persistence that seemed to produce results even in the most challenging circumstances. More significantly, she discovered that conversations with Mike had begun to affect her interactions in other contexts. During a particularly contentious budget meeting with city officials, instead of immediately defaulting to her usual strategy of overwhelming opposition with data and logical superiority, she found herself listening more carefully to underlying concerns and addressing them with something approaching empathy rather than dismissal. The meeting had concluded with unanimous approval for veteran services funding increases, but more importantly, several participants had commented afterward on her collaborative approach. Elmira later observed that Danica seemed to be developing what she called diplomatic effectiveness that went beyond her already impressive analytical capabilities. "You're connecting with people instead of just convincing them," Elmira noted during one of their weekly review sessions. "It's actually more persuasive than pure logic alone." The observation prompted Danica to recognize that her emotional re-engagement was producing measurable improvements in professional effectiveness rather than compromising it. Mike's insights about emotions, providing additional data for decision-making, were proving accurate in ways she hadn't anticipated. Their conversations also began to extend into territory that was unmistakably personal rather than professional. Mike shared stories about his daughter Celia's weekend visits, describing her elaborate theories about why certain playground equipment had specific rules and her ongoing campaign to convince him that ice cream constituted a legitimate breakfast food under certain meteorological conditions. "She's got this thing about rainy Saturday mornings," Mike explained with obvious paternal pride. "According to Celia, rain means the universe is sad, and the only way to cheer it up is by eating something that makes you happy. Ice cream makes her happy, therefore ice cream for breakfast on rainy Saturdays is actually a public service." That's surprisingly sophisticated reasoning for someone her age, Danica observed, finding herself genuinely charmed by the 8-year-old's logic. "She gets that from her mother," Mike said with a smile that contained complicated emotions Danica was learning to recognize. Sarah was always good at finding creative solutions to problems that seemed impossible. It was the first time Mike had mentioned his ex-wife directly, and Danica sensed layers of story beneath the simple statement. She'd become curious about his personal history in ways that went beyond professional interest, though she wasn't entirely sure what to do with that curiosity. "The divorce was difficult?" she asked carefully, testing the boundaries of their developing friendship. "The marriage was difficult," Mike corrected gently. "The divorce was actually a relief for everyone involved, including Celia. Sometimes people can care about each other deeply without being able to live together successfully. Sarah's a good person and a great mother. We just turned out to be better at co-parenting than being married." The matter-of-fact way Mike discussed his failed marriage impressed Danica with its lack of bitterness or defensiveness. He seemed to have processed the experience as a learning opportunity rather than a personal failure, which was an approach to relationship analysis that she found both foreign and compelling. "Have you considered pursuing another serious relationship?" she heard herself asking, immediately wondering where the question had come from. Mike paused in his work replacing a section of baseboard trim and looked at her with an expression that suggested he was considering multiple levels of response. "I've been thinking about it more lately," he said finally. "For a long time after the divorce, I was focused on figuring out how to be a good single parent and establishing stability for Celia. But she's getting older, more independent, and I'm starting to think maybe there's room in our lives for someone else who understands how families work. Something about his phrasing suggested deeper meaning, but Danica found herself uncertain how to interpret his response. Was he speaking hypothetically about future possibilities, or was there subtext she was missing? The uncertainty was both frustrating and oddly exciting, emotions she hadn't experienced in so long that recognizing them felt like archaeological discovery. Their relationship began to include activities that extended beyond their Tuesday and Thursday community center encounters. When Mike mentioned that he was taking Celia to the Riverside County Fair during one of her weekend visits, Danica surprised both of them by expressing interest in attending the same event. "I haven't been to a county fair in over 20 years," she admitted. "It might be interesting to observe current community social dynamics in an informal setting." Mike's grin suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her anthropological justification, but he offered to meet her there Saturday afternoon if she was serious about attending. The prospect of spending time together in a completely social context should have triggered every professional boundary alarm Danica had developed, but instead she found herself looking forward to the experience with anticipation that felt almost like excitement. Saturday afternoon at the Riverside County Fair proved to be a revelation in ways Danica hadn't anticipated. Watching Mike interact with his daughter provided insights into aspects of his character that their workplace conversations had only hinted at. Celia was indeed as intelligent and opinionated as her father had suggested, but she was also clearly comfortable expressing affection in ways that spoke to years of secure attachment and emotional availability. "Dad, you have to try the funnel cake," Celia insisted, dragging Mike toward a food vendor with the determination of someone accustomed to getting her way through reasonable persuasion. "It's basically breakfast food, but with extra sugar and happiness added." "That's some pretty compelling logic," Mike agreed solemnly. "I'm not sure I can argue with happiness enhancement as a dietary strategy." Danica found herself genuinely amused by their interaction, recognizing the same gentle humor that had initially caught her attention, but seeing it now in the context of established family dynamics. Mike's parenting style seemed to combine clear expectations with genuine respect for his daughter's developing autonomy, creating an environment where Celia felt safe to express herself authentically. "Are you General Quelmont?" Celia asked suddenly, turning her attention to Danica with the direct curiosity of childhood. "Dad said you work with veterans and that you're really good at solving complicated problems." "I am General Quelmont," Danica confirmed, uncertain how to interact with children but willing to try. "Your father is correct about my professional focus." "Cool," Celia said with satisfaction. "Dad says you're helping make sure veterans get better help when they need it." "That's important because my friend Jake's dad was in the Army, and sometimes he has bad days where he needs extra support." The casual sophistication of Celia's understanding impressed Danica almost as much as her matter-of-fact acceptance of complex adult realities. Mike had clearly raised his daughter to understand challenging concepts without being overwhelmed by them, which suggested emotional intelligence that went far beyond simple parenting techniques. The afternoon continued with Danica observing Mike and Celia navigate the fair with practiced efficiency, but she gradually found herself being included in their activities rather than simply watching from professional distance. When Celia insisted on trying the ring toss game, Mike enlisted Danica's help in providing strategic advice based on what he claimed were her superior analytical capabilities. General Quelmont has extensive experience with precision targeting, Mike explained to his daughter with theatrical seriousness. "I think she might be able to help us develop an effective approach to ring toss domination." The absurdity of applying military strategic analysis to carnival games should have been ridiculous, but somehow Mike's presentation made it feel like collaborative problem-solving rather than condescending adult humor. Danica found herself genuinely engaged in helping Celia calculate optimal throwing angles and trajectory adjustments. And when the 8-year-old successfully won a small stuffed elephant after implementing their strategy, she felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with professional accomplishment. "We make a good team," Celia announced, offering to share her prize with Danica. "You should come to more fun places with us." The invitation was issued with the casual confidence of childhood, but Danica recognized it as something more significant than simple politeness. Celia's acceptance felt like approval from someone whose opinion clearly mattered enormously to Mike, and receiving it generated emotions that Danica was still learning to identify and process. As the afternoon wound down, and they prepared to part ways, Mike walked Danica to her car while Celia examined her stuffed elephant and planned its integration into her existing toy hierarchy. "Thank you for today," Mike said quietly. "Celia doesn't usually warm up to new people that quickly, but she clearly enjoys your company." "The experience was more engaging than I anticipated," Danica replied, recognizing the inadequacy of her words to convey the afternoon's actual impact. "Your daughter is remarkably perceptive." "She gets that from her mother too," Mike said with a smile. "But I think she also recognizes good people when she meets them. Kids are pretty reliable judges of character." Something about his tone suggested deeper meaning, but before Danica could analyze the implications, Celia appeared at Mike's side with a question about dinner plans and the logistics of stuffed elephant transportation. As they said their goodbyes, Danica found herself driving home with a strange sense of completion, as if she'd successfully passed some kind of test she hadn't realized she was taking. For the first time in 20 years, Danica Quelmont went to bed thinking about the future with something that felt remarkably like hope. The call came at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning in early December, jerking Danica from the first peaceful sleep she'd experienced in months. The voice on the other end belonged to General Marcus Tharvin, her former commanding officer and current Pentagon liaison for Veteran Affairs initiatives. His tone carried the crisp urgency that always preceded significant career developments. "Danica, I need you in Washington by Thursday morning. Secretary Davidson wants to personally brief you on a new position that's opening up. Deputy Director of National Veterans Affairs, reporting directly to the Secretary. It's the kind of opportunity that comes along once in a career." Danica sat up in bed, her military training immediately engaging as she processed the information. Deputy Director was a position she'd been working toward for her entire civilian career, representing the culmination of 20 years of strategic planning and professional development. It was also, she realized with a clarity that surprised her, a job that would require relocating to Washington and abandoning the life she'd been carefully rebuilding in her current city. "What's the timeline for transition?" she asked, already calculating the logistics of potential career advancement. "If you accept, they want you to start January 15th. It's a fast track, which means they're serious about wanting you specifically for this role. Danica, this is it. This is the position. That puts you in charge of veteran policy for the entire country." After hanging up, Danica sat in her apartment's pre-dawn darkness, staring at the city lights visible from her bedroom window and trying to process the magnitude of what had just been offered. Deputy Director of National Veterans Affairs was the job she'd been preparing for since leaving active duty. It represented everything she'd worked toward, the logical culmination of a career trajectory that had defined her identity for 2 decades. It was also a job that would require leaving behind the most significant personal connections she'd developed since returning from Afghanistan. The thought of not seeing Mike's gentle smile on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, of missing Celia's weekend stories about playground politics and ice cream breakfast theories, of returning to the emotional isolation that had defined her existence for 20 years, created a physical sensation in her chest that she finally recognized as genuine distress. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of professional preparation and personal turmoil. Danica threw herself into research about the deputy director position, analyzing organizational charts, reviewing policy frameworks, and preparing for what she knew would be an intensive interview process. But underneath her professional focus ran an undercurrent of emotional confusion that she couldn't seem to resolve through logical analysis. Thursday morning in Washington proceeded exactly as expected. The Pentagon building impressed with its massive efficiency. The briefing rooms hummed with serious purpose. And Secretary Davidson proved to be everything her reputation suggested: brilliant, demanding, and absolutely committed to revolutionizing veteran services on a national scale. "General Quelmont," Secretary Davidson said during their 2-hour private meeting, "your work on transitional housing initiatives has been exceptional. The model you developed is being implemented in 6 states, and the preliminary results suggest it could transform how we approach veteran reintegration nationwide." The praise was specific and well-informed, indicating that Danica's civilian work had indeed caught the attention of the highest levels of Veteran Affairs Administration. Secretary Davidson outlined a vision for systemic change that was both ambitious and achievable, exactly the kind of challenge that Danica's strategic capabilities were designed to address. The deputy director position would give you the authority and resources to implement these programs nationally. Secretary Davidson continued, "You'd be working directly with Congress, coordinating with state-level administrators, and essentially writing policy that affects millions of veterans across the country." It was everything Danica had worked toward, presented by someone who clearly understood her capabilities and shared her commitment to veteran services. The logical response was immediate acceptance, followed by careful negotiation of timeline and resource allocation details. Instead, Danica heard herself asking, what flexibility would the position offer in terms of geographic stability and work-life balance? Secretary Davidson's eyebrows rose slightly, suggesting this wasn't a typical concern from candidates for high-level Pentagon positions. "The deputy director role is demanding, as I'm sure you understand. Washington posting is required, and the position typically involves significant travel and extended hours, especially during the initial implementation period." The conversation continued for another hour, covering policy details and administrative expectations, but Danica found her attention increasingly divided between professional assessment and personal calculation. The job was everything she'd wanted, when wanting it was the only thing that mattered. But 20 years of emotional shutdown had apparently ended more completely than she'd realized, because now other things mattered too. The flight home Friday evening provided 3 hours of uninterrupted time to analyze what had become an unexpectedly complex decision. Danica had always made career choices based on strategic advancement and professional impact, treating personal considerations as irrelevant complications that weakened decision-making effectiveness. But sitting in the airplane 30,000 feet above the country she'd devoted her career to serving, she couldn't stop thinking about Mike's observation that emotional engagement actually improved professional effectiveness rather than compromising it. Saturday morning brought the first real test of her evolving emotional priorities. Mike had invited her to join him and Celia for their traditional weekend breakfast at Murphy's Diner, a local institution that specialized in comfort food and conversation. Danica arrived to find them already seated in a corner booth, Celia explaining to her father why Saturday mornings required pancakes with extra syrup to properly prepare for weekend adventures. "General Danica," Celia called out with genuine pleasure, waving enthusiastically from across the restaurant. The greeting drew amused glances from other diners, but Danica found she didn't care about the attention in ways that would have bothered her just months earlier. "Good morning, Celia," Danica replied, sliding into the booth and accepting the menu Mike offered with a smile that felt increasingly natural. "I trust you've already determined the optimal breakfast strategy for today's activities." "Absolutely," Celia confirmed with serious 8-year-old authority. "Pancakes for sustainable energy, orange juice for vitamin enhancement, and bacon for protein optimization." Dad says you can help us plan our museum expedition strategy. The Natural History Museum had been Celia's choice for their Saturday adventure, and Mike had enlisted Danica's analytical capabilities to help maximize their educational efficiency while accommodating an 8-year-old's attention span and energy level. It was exactly the kind of collaborative problem-solving that Danica had learned to enjoy, combining practical planning with genuine care for outcomes that mattered to people she'd grown to love. The realization stopped her mid-conversation about dinosaur exhibit logistics. Love. She loved Mike Doran and his remarkable daughter, loved their weekend breakfast traditions and Tuesday afternoon conversations, loved the way they'd helped her rediscover parts of herself she'd thought were permanently lost. The emotion was so clear and undeniable that she wondered how she'd managed to avoid recognizing it until this moment. "Everything okay?" Mike asked quietly, noticing her sudden silence with the attentiveness she'd come to associate with his gentle perceptiveness. "I received a job offer," Danica said, the words emerging before her logical mind could intervene with strategic communication planning. "Deputy Director of National Veterans Affairs. In Washington." The statement hung in the air like a physical presence, changing the emotional temperature of their conversation in ways that all three of them immediately recognized. Celia looked confused, clearly sensing adult tension without understanding its source. Mike's expression went carefully neutral in a way that reminded Danica of his military background. "That's a significant opportunity," Mike said finally, his tone professional and supportive, despite what might have been disappointment around the edges. "National-level policy work, substantial impact potential. It sounds like exactly the kind of position your career has been building toward." His response was everything Danica should have wanted: rational analysis, professional support, recognition of career advancement opportunities. But what she actually wanted, she realized with startling clarity, was for him to ask her not to go, to acknowledge that their developing relationship mattered enough to factor into major life decisions, to admit that walking away from what they'd been building would be a loss for both of them. "Are you going to take it?" Celia asked with the direct curiosity of childhood, cutting through adult conversational complexity with characteristic 8-year-old efficiency. "I don't know," Danica admitted, recognizing that uncertainty is the most honest thing she'd said in days. "It's complicated." "Grown-up decisions usually are," Mike said gently, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand in a gesture that was both supportive and somehow final. "But you have to do what's right for your career and your future. Opportunities like this don't come along often." The conversation shifted to safer topics after that, but Danica could feel something fundamental changing between them. Mike's withdrawal was subtle but unmistakable, the careful retreat of someone protecting himself from inevitable disappointment. He was already beginning to let her go, accepting her departure as the logical outcome of their relationship's collision with serious career advancement. By the time they parted ways Saturday afternoon, Danica felt as if she were watching her carefully rebuilt emotional world disintegrating in real time. Mike's goodbye was warm, but definitely felt like a goodbye, and Celia's hug carried the uncertain clinginess of someone sensing that important adults were about to disappear from her life again. Sunday passed in a blur of professional analysis and personal anguish. Danica reviewed her notes from the Washington meetings, researched deputy director responsibilities, and prepared detailed assessments of the position's strategic advantages. But every logical argument for accepting the job was countered by emotional considerations she no longer seemed capable of dismissing. Monday morning brought a call from Secretary Davidson's office requesting her decision by Wednesday morning. Tuesday's community center meeting felt like a wake, with Mike maintaining professional courtesy while avoiding anything approaching personal conversation. The careful distance he maintained was probably meant to make her decision easier, but It only reinforced her growing understanding of what accepting the Washington position would actually cost. Tuesday evening, alone in her apartment with the Washington job offer sitting on her desk like an ultimatum, Danica finally acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding for 3 days. She didn't want the job. Not because it wasn't an excellent opportunity, not because she couldn't excel in the role, but because success no longer felt worth achieving at the cost of the relationships that had taught her how to be human again. The realization was both liberating and terrifying, representing a fundamental shift in values that challenged everything she'd believed about career priorities and professional identity for the past 20 years. Wednesday morning arrived gray and cold, matching Danica's emotional state as she sat in her office staring at the phone number for Secretary Davidson's office. The call needed to be made within the next 2 hours, and she still hadn't definitively decided what her response would be. Every logical analysis pointed toward accepting the deputy director position, but logic seemed to have lost its absolute authority over her decision-making process. Elmira knocked and entered with her usual morning efficiency, carrying coffee and the day's schedule, but stopped short when she saw Danica's expression. "You look like someone facing a firing squad," she observed with characteristic directness. "Is this about the Washington job?" "I'm experiencing difficulty reconciling professional advancement with personal considerations," Danica admitted, recognizing that her usual strategic clarity had been replaced by emotional complexity that defied simple analysis. "Personal considerations," Elmira repeated thoughtfully. "You mean Mike Doran and his daughter?" The accuracy of Elmira's assessment was both startling and somehow comforting. Danica had assumed her developing relationships were invisible to professional observation, but clearly her assistant had been paying closer attention than she'd realized. "How did you reach that conclusion?" Danica asked, genuinely curious about what external evidence had revealed her internal transformation. "You've been different for the past few months," Elmira explained, settling into the chair across from Danica's desk with the familiarity of someone who'd earned the right to speak candidly. "More relaxed, more collaborative, more present in conversations. You smile occasionally, which never happened before. And you've rearranged your entire schedule around Tuesday and Thursday afternoon meetings that could easily be handled by phone." The behavioral evidence was overwhelming when presented systematically. Danica had indeed restructured her professional priorities around opportunities to spend time with Mike, though she'd convinced herself these changes were motivated by improved operational efficiency rather than personal attachment. The Washington position represents the culmination of 20 years of career development, Danica said, testing her rational arguments against Elmira's practical perspective. "Declining would be professionally irrational, would it?" Elmira asked, clearly prepared to challenge conventional wisdom. "You've already achieved more in veteran services than most people accomplish in entire careers. Your current work is making measurable impact, and you have the flexibility to pursue initiatives that matter to you personally. What exactly would the Washington job provide that you don't already have?" The question forced Danica to examine her motivations more carefully than she'd been willing to do. What did she actually want from the deputy director position, beyond the abstract satisfaction of career advancement? The authority to implement national policy was appealing, but her current role already provided significant influence over program development. The prestige was undeniable, but prestige had never been a primary motivator for her professional choices. "The opportunity to effect change on a larger scale," she said finally, recognizing even as she spoke that the answer felt incomplete. "And you couldn't achieve similar impact by continuing to develop innovative programs here, than consulting with national administrators on implementation?" Elmira pressed. "Your transitional housing model is already being adopted nationwide. Your influence is growing organically based on results rather than position authority." Before Danica could respond, Her phone rang with a call that would transform her careful analysis into immediate crisis. Mike's voice on the other end carried an urgency that immediately activated her emergency response protocols. "Danica, I need your help. Celia's been in an accident. She's okay, but she's in the hospital, and I'm having trouble navigating the insurance authorization process for some of the treatments they want to do. I know you're busy with the Washington decision, but you're the only person I know who understands how to fight bureaucracy effectively." 20 years of military training kicked in immediately. Which hospital? What kind of accident? What specific authorizations are they requiring? Mercy General. She fell from playground equipment at school and has a concussion plus a broken wrist. The emergency treatment is covered, but they want to do some additional cognitive testing. That requires pre-authorization, and the insurance company is being difficult about approving it. Danica was already reaching for her car keys. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Don't sign anything or agree to any modifications until I arrive." The drive to Mercy General passed in a blur of strategic planning and emotional focus that felt remarkably similar to preparing for military operations. But underneath her professional response ran a current of personal terror that was entirely new. The possibility of losing someone whose well-being had become fundamentally important to her own sense of purpose and meaning. She found Mike in the pediatric wing waiting room, looking exhausted and worried in ways that activated every protective instinct she'd developed over 2 decades of caring for soldiers under stress. Without thinking about professional boundaries or appropriate behavioral protocols, she walked directly to him and wrapped her arms around him in a gesture of comfort that surprised both of them. "How is she?" Danica asked, maintaining the embrace, while assessing his stress level and emotional stability. "Scared but stable," Mike replied, relaxing into her support with obvious relief. "The doctors say the concussion is mild and the wrist will heal fine, but they want to do additional testing to rule out any cognitive impact, and the insurance company is claiming it's not medically necessary." "Show me the documentation," Danica said, shifting immediately into problem-solving mode. Insurance authorization is essentially a negotiation process. The key is understanding what evidence they actually require versus what they're claiming to require. The next 3 hours demonstrated everything Danica had learned about effective bureaucracy. Navigation, but applied with an emotional investment that made her usual professional competence feel almost irrelevant by comparison. She spoke with insurance representatives, consulted with hospital administrators, and reviewed medical protocols with the focused intensity of someone for whom failure was simply not an acceptable outcome. When the authorizations finally came through and Celia's additional tests were approved, Mike looked at her with an expression that contained gratitude, admiration, and something deeper that made Danica's chest tighten with recognition. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said quietly, while they waited for Celia to return from her final round of testing. "The insurance company would have worn me down eventually, and I would have just accepted their initial denial." "No, you wouldn't have," Danica corrected with absolute certainty. "You would have found another way, because that's what parents do. I just happen to have specific experience with the process." "Still," Mike insisted, reaching for her hand with the kind of intentional gesture that indicated important communication was coming. "Having you here, knowing I could call you and you'd drop everything to help us, that means more than I can adequately express." Before Danica could respond, Celia appeared in the doorway with her arm in a bright pink cast and a slightly dazed but definitely cheerful expression. "General Danica, Dad said you helped fight the mean insurance people, so I could get all my tests done." "Your father handled the important parts," Danica said, kneeling down to Celia's eye level. "I just provided some tactical support. Does this mean you're not going to Washington?" Celia asked with a direct curiosity that had become one of her most endearing characteristics. "Because I was worried that if you took that job, we wouldn't get to have breakfast together anymore. The question cut straight through 20 years of career-focused decision-making and forced Danica to confront the truth she'd been avoiding since Saturday morning. She didn't want to go to Washington. Not because the opportunity wasn't valuable. Not because she couldn't succeed in the role, but because success had fundamentally redefined itself in her mind. No, Danica said, making the decision with a clarity that felt like stepping into sunlight after months of fog. I'm not going to Washington. I'm staying here, where my family is. The words slipped out before she could analyze its implications. But it felt so absolutely correct that she didn't want to take it back. Mike's eyes widened with what looked like hope and relief, while Celia's face broke into a grin that made her resemblance to her father unmistakable. Family? Mike repeated, his tone careful but unmistakably pleased. Pleased. If that's acceptable to both of you, Danica said, recognizing that she was making the biggest emotional leap of her adult life and finding that it felt like flying rather than falling. Mike's answer came in the form of a kiss that was gentle, certain, and full of everything they'd been building toward for months without quite knowing how to name it. When they broke apart, Celia was watching them with the satisfied expression of someone whose strategic planning had achieved its intended results. Good, she announced with 8-year-old authority. Now we can start planning our next adventures. Together, but first, can we get ice cream? Because medical emergencies definitely qualify for therapeutic dessert consumption. As they walked out of the hospital together, Celia between them chattering about cast decoration strategies and weekend breakfast modifications, Danica realized that declining the Washington job wasn't a sacrifice at all. It was simply choosing a different kind of success, one measured in laughter shared and love given freely rather than positions held and policies implemented. For the first time in 20 years, General Danica Quelmont was exactly where she belonged. 3 months after Celia's hospital emergency, Danica found herself experiencing a life that would have been unrecognizable to the woman who had first encountered Mike Doran fixing a temperamental boiler. The changes extended far beyond her relationship with Mike and Celia, rippling outward to transform every aspect of her professional and personal existence in ways that continued to surprise her with their scope and significance. The first major indication of her transformation came during a contentious city council meeting in February, where budget cuts threatened to eliminate several veteran support programs that Danica had spent years developing. The old version of herself would have approached the challenge with cold logical arguments, overwhelming opposition with data and strategic analysis until resistance crumbled under the weight of irrefutable evidence. Instead, Danica found herself telling stories. She spoke about Marcus Thalvin, a veteran who had transitioned from homelessness to stable housing through the transitional program now facing elimination. She described Elena Rodriguez, a former Army medic who had overcome PTSD through community-based therapy initiatives that the budget cuts would destroy. She shared Jake Morrison's journey from substance abuse to successful business ownership, made possible by vocational training programs that were about to disappear. These aren't just statistics and budget spreadsheets, Danica told the council members, her voice carrying an emotional resonance that commanded attention in ways her previous presentations never had. These are real people whose lives have been fundamentally changed by programs that cost less than the city spends on office supplies, but generate returns measured in human dignity and community contribution that no budget analysis can adequately capture. The council voted unanimously to preserve the veteran programs, but several members approached Danica afterward to comment on the presentation's unusual effectiveness. Councilwoman Jasmine Orville pulled her aside specifically to observe that her advocacy had evolved from impressive to genuinely compelling. You've always been knowledgeable and professional, Jasmine noted, but tonight you made us feel the importance of these programs rather than just understand them intellectually. That's a rare skill in government work. The comment prompted Danica to recognize how thoroughly her professional approach had been transformed by emotional re-engagement. She discovered that caring about outcomes actually improved her ability to achieve them, because emotional investment generated creative energy and persuasive authenticity that pure logic alone couldn't match. This transformation became even more evident in her work with individual veterans seeking assistance. Previously, Danica had approached each case as a problem requiring systematic analysis and appropriate resource allocation. Now she found herself genuinely interested in the people behind the problems, taking time to understand their specific circumstances and individual needs in ways that revealed solutions she might have missed through purely analytical assessment. Thomas Shun, a recently discharged Marine struggling with civilian job placement, became a perfect example of her evolved approach. The old Danica would have reviewed his qualifications, matched them to available opportunities, and provided appropriate referrals with efficient professionalism. The new Danica spent 3 hours with Thomas, learning about his interests, his concerns about civilian workplace culture, and his specific anxieties about transitioning from military structure to corporate environment. That conversation revealed that Thomas's real challenge wasn't lack of qualifications, but fear of civilian social interaction after years of military community. Danica connected him not just with job opportunities, but with Mike's informal veteran support network at the community center, where Thomas could practice civilian conversation skills in a low-pressure environment while building relationships with other successful transitioning veterans. 6 weeks later, Thomas had not only secured employment, but had become a mentor for newly discharged veterans, sharing strategies for civilian workplace navigation that he'd developed through his own successful transition. The outcome was far superior to anything Danica could have achieved through standard case management procedures, but it had required emotional engagement and creative problem-solving that her previous approach would never have accessed. Her relationship with Mike and Celia continued to deepen in ways that consistently challenged and expanded her emotional capabilities. Mike had officially introduced her to his ex-wife Sarah during one of Celia's custody transitions, a meeting that Danica had approached with military-level strategic preparation, but which had turned out to require entirely different skills. Sarah proved to be exactly as Mike had described: intelligent, kind, and genuinely committed to maintaining positive co-parenting relationships for Celia's benefit. Their conversation had been warm and surprisingly easy, with Sarah expressing genuine appreciation for Danica's positive influence on both Mike and Celia. "Mike's been different since he started spending time with you," Sarah observed during their coffee meeting. "More confident, more optimistic about the future. And Celia talks about you constantly. Always General Danica this, and General Danica that. You've clearly become very important to both of them." The acceptance from someone whose opinion mattered so much to Mike felt like receiving official approval for their relationship's legitimacy. But more significantly, Sarah's warmth toward her represented successful navigation of complex family dynamics that required emotional intelligence rather than strategic maneuvering. Celia's attitude toward their developing relationship proved to be the most challenging and rewarding aspect of Danica's emotional growth. The 8-year-old had appointed herself unofficial coordinator of family activities, regularly proposing elaborate plans for weekend adventures that required increasing levels of collaboration between all 3 adults in her life. "I think we should have a family game night," Celia announced during one of their regular breakfast meetings. "Dad, you can make your famous chili. General Danica can bring her analytical skills for strategy games. And Mom can come too because she's really good at charades, and also she makes the best brownies." The complexity of orchestrating social events that included Mike's ex-wife should have been daunting, but Danica found herself genuinely enjoying the challenge of creating positive family experiences that honored everyone's relationships and contributions. Her military planning skills proved surprisingly applicable to organizing birthday parties and holiday celebrations, though the success metrics were laughter and shared affection rather than operational efficiency. More importantly, these family gatherings provided opportunities for Danica to practice emotional availability in group settings, learning to express affection and humor in ways that felt natural rather than performed. Watching Mike and Sarah work together as co-parents taught her valuable lessons about maintaining positive relationships even after romantic connections had ended, while Celia's easy acceptance of complex family dynamics demonstrated the resilience possible when adults prioritized emotional health over personal ego. By spring, Danica had reached a level of emotional integration that amazed everyone who knew her, including herself. Elmira commented that working with her had become significantly more enjoyable because she'd developed what she called human accessibility that made collaboration feel like partnership rather than subordination. "You still have the same analytical brilliance," Elmira explained, "but now you also listen to emotional feedback and incorporate it into your decision-making process. It makes your leadership more effective because people feel heard and valued rather than simply managed." The observation was validated during a major policy presentation to state-level administrators, where Danica's combination of logical analysis and emotional engagement produced the kind of unanimous support that had previously seemed impossible to achieve. Her recommendations for expanding veteran services received not just approval, but enthusiastic endorsement from officials who had historically been resistant to increased spending on social programs. "General Quelmont has achieved something remarkable," noted State Veterans Affairs Director Carl Maurick during the post-presentation discussion. "She's demonstrated that effective veteran support isn't just morally necessary, it's economically advantageous and politically sustainable. Her programs generate measurable returns on investment while creating positive outcomes that everyone can support." The professional recognition was gratifying, but Danica found herself more interested in the personal transformation that had made such success possible. She'd learned to access emotional intelligence as a strategic resource rather than treating feelings as operational vulnerabilities, and the results exceeded anything she'd achieved through purely analytical approaches. Her relationship with Mike had evolved into something that felt both inevitable and miraculous. They'd fallen into comfortable patterns of domestic partnership without formal declarations or strategic discussions, simply allowing their lives to merge naturally around shared values and complementary strengths. Mike's gentle humor balanced her analytical intensity, while her strategic capabilities provided structure for his creative, problem-solving approaches. Their Tuesday and Thursday community center meetings had expanded into regular volunteer work, with Danica helping Mike coordinate programs for transitioning veterans while he assisted her with policy development that incorporated practical implementation considerations. They'd become an effective team in ways that extended far beyond romantic partnership, combining their individual skills to create outcomes neither could have achieved independently. But it was during Celia's spring school presentation about family traditions that Danica experienced the most profound moment of recognition about how completely her life had been transformed. Celia had chosen to present about their weekly breakfast meetings, describing them as family planning sessions where we decide on adventures and also where General Danica teaches me about strategic thinking while Dad teaches me about being kind to people and broken things. Sitting in the elementary school auditorium, watching Celia confidently explain to her classmates how their unconventional family worked, Danica realized that she'd somehow become exactly the person she'd never imagined. She could be someone who belonged in a family, who contributed to other people's happiness, who had learned to express love without fear and receive it without suspicion. The 8-year-old's presentation concluded with the announcement that General Danica is going to ask Dad to marry her soon, because she told me she's never been happier and she wants to make sure we're officially a family forever. The revelation drew amused chuckles from other parents, but it made Danica's heart stop because Celia was absolutely right. She had confided her marriage intentions to the 8-year-old during a private conversation about family dynamics, though. She hadn't expected that confidence to become part of a public school presentation. Mike's expression when he turned to look at her was pure delight mixed with surprised anticipation. "Is that so?" he whispered, taking her hand with the kind of intentional gesture that suggested important conversations were about to follow. "Apparently my strategic planning has become transparent to elementary school observers," Danica whispered back, recognizing that her careful emotional walls had been so thoroughly dismantled that even 8-year-olds could read her intentions accurately. "Good," Mike replied with a grin that contained 20 years' worth of hope and possibility. "Because I was starting to worry you might not realize how much I love you." As they sat in that school auditorium, listening to other children present about their family traditions while planning the conversation that would officially unite them as a family, Danica marveled at the journey that had brought her from emotional isolation to this moment of absolute belonging. The woman who had arrived at Pinewood Community Center 9 months ago, frozen behind 20 years of protective barriers, had been replaced by someone who could laugh freely, love openly, and build a future based on connection rather than control. The transformation felt like a miracle. But Danica was beginning to understand that miracles were simply what happened when you finally became brave enough to let other people matter to you more than your own protective mechanisms. 1 year later, on a crisp October afternoon that perfectly mirrored the day Danica had first encountered Mike Doran wrestling with a temperamental boiler, the Pinewood Community Center was buzzing with activity that had nothing to do with heating repairs or budget meetings. The main hall had been transformed into something between a wedding venue and a community celebration, decorated with autumn flowers and filled with an eclectic mix of city officials, veteran service providers, community center regulars, and what appeared to be half of Celia's elementary school class. Danica stood in the center's small conference room, adjusting her dress for the 3rd time while trying to process the surreal reality that she was about to get married in the same building where she'd first heard genuine laughter escape from her own lips. The dress was elegant but simple, chosen specifically because Celia had declared that fancy wedding dresses are impractical for family celebrations where kids might spill things. Elmira knocked and entered, carrying a small bouquet of autumn roses mixed with what appeared to be playground flowers that had clearly been selected by someone with very specific aesthetic opinions. "Celia insisted on contributing to your bouquet design," Elmira explained with an amused smile. "She said the fancy flowers were beautiful, but they needed adventure flowers to represent how you and Mike found each other. The gesture was so perfectly representative of their unconventional family dynamic that Danica felt her chest tighten with the kind of overwhelming affection she'd learned to recognize and embrace, rather than suppress. 9 months ago, the idea of incorporating playground flowers into wedding arrangements would have seemed absurd. Now it felt like exactly the right touch of authenticity for a ceremony, celebrating relationships built on genuine connection rather than social convention. "How's the groom handling pre-wedding logistics?" Danica asked, recognizing her need for operational updates even in the midst of personal milestones. "Mike's been testing the sound system for the past hour," Elmira reported, with obvious amusement. "He claims he's ensuring technical reliability, but I think he's just enjoying the opportunity to provide commentary about microphone personality disorders to anyone who will listen." The observation made Danica laugh with the same spontaneous joy that had marked her transformation from emotional isolation to full engagement with life's absurdities. Mike's gentle humor had become one of her favorite things about their relationship, representing everything she'd learned about finding joy in everyday moments, rather than reserving happiness for major achievements. Soft knock interrupted her reflection, followed by Celia's voice calling, "General Danica, can I come in?" I have something important to give you." "Of course," Danica replied, opening the door to find Celia dressed in a purple dress that she'd selected, specifically because it was fancy enough for weddings but practical enough for dancing afterward. In her hands, she carried a small wrapped box that she presented with the serious ceremony of someone delivering state secrets. "This is from me and Dad and Mom," Celia announced, referring to Sarah with the casual inclusion that had become natural since their families had merged into something beautifully complicated but undeniably functional. "Mom helped me pick it out and Dad helped me wrap it, but I chose it myself because I know you the best." Inside the box was a simple silver locket engraved with coordinates that Danica immediately recognized as the latitude and longitude of Pinewood Community Center. When she opened it, she found a tiny photo of the three of them from their first county fair adventure, grinning at the camera with the slightly surprised expressions of people who had just discovered they belonged together. "It's so you never forget where our family started," Celia explained with 8-year-old wisdom that consistently amazed the adults in her life. "And also so you have us with you when you're doing important general work and need to remember that you're not just a general anymore, you're also a mom." The casual use of mom hit Danica with emotional force that nearly knocked her off balance. They'd never formally discussed parental terminology, allowing Celia to navigate the relationship dynamics in whatever way felt natural to her. But hearing herself officially designated as family by someone whose opinion mattered more than any professional recognition felt like receiving the highest honor of her entire career. "Thank you," Danica managed, though the words felt completely inadequate to express the magnitude of gratitude she felt for being included in this remarkable child's definition of family. "I love it, and I love you, and I promise to wear it always." "Good," Celia said with satisfaction, then added with typical 8-year-old practicality, "Now we should probably go get you married, because Dad's starting to tell the microphone jokes that mean he's getting nervous, and people are beginning to laugh at him instead of with him." The ceremony itself proved to be everything Danica hadn't known she wanted: simple, authentic, and focused on the people who mattered, rather than elaborate traditions that served no personal significance. Mike stood at the front of the room looking slightly overwhelmed, but absolutely radiant, while their small gathering of family and friends created an atmosphere of genuine celebration rather than formal obligation. Mayor Jorvan Stradel had volunteered to officiate, claiming that anyone who had contributed as much to community well-being as Danica deserved to have their wedding performed by someone who understood the value of public service. His remarks focused on the importance of partnerships that made both individuals stronger and more effective, which felt perfectly appropriate for a couple whose relationship had enhanced rather than compromised their individual capabilities. When it came time for vows, Danica found herself speaking from the heart with an emotional openness that would have been impossible before. Mike taught her that vulnerability was actually a form of strength rather than weakness. 9 months ago, I was convinced that emotional connection was incompatible with professional effectiveness. She began, her voice carrying clearly through the room without amplification. I'd spent 20 years building walls that I thought were protecting me, but which were actually imprisoning me in a life that looked successful from the outside, while feeling empty from the inside. She looked directly at Mike, whose expression contained all the love and patience that had made her transformation possible. "You taught me that caring about people doesn't make you weak, it makes you wise. That laughter isn't a distraction from serious work, it's what makes serious work sustainable. That building a family doesn't limit your potential, it expands your definition of what success actually means." Turning to include Celia in her remarks, Danica continued, "You both showed me that love isn't something you earn through perfect performance, it's something you receive through genuine connection. And that the best families aren't the ones that look conventional, they're the ones that choose each other intentionally and support each other unconditionally." Mike's vows focused on admiration for Danica's journey from isolation to connection, praising her courage in choosing to rebuild her emotional life despite the risks involved. But it was Celia who provided the most memorable moment of the ceremony. When Mayor Stradle asked if anyone had additional words to share about the couple. "I just want to say," Celia announced, standing up with the confidence of someone accustomed to public speaking, "that General Danica is the best mom anyone could ask for, even though she didn't start out knowing how to be a mom. She learned. Because she loves us, and she teaches me that being smart means caring about people, not just knowing facts." The 8-year-old's endorsement generated more emotional impact than any formal wedding blessing could have achieved, representing the ultimate validation of Danica's successful transformation from strategic analyst to full human being. The reception that followed proved to be exactly as unconventional and joyful as their courtship had been. Instead of formal dinner service, they'd arranged for Murphy's Diner to cater with comfort food that encouraged conversation rather than careful eating. Mike had enlisted several veterans from his community center programs to help with setup and coordination, creating an atmosphere of collaborative celebration that reflected their shared commitment to community service. Thomas Chun, the Marine veteran whose successful transition Danica had facilitated through emotional rather than purely analytical support, approached her during the reception to express gratitude that extended far beyond professional assistance. "You saved my life," he said simply, "not just by helping me find work, but by showing me that veterans can build new kinds of families after military service. Watching you and Mike together taught me that it's possible to love people without losing yourself." Similar conversations occurred throughout the evening, as various community members shared stories about how Danica's transformation had influenced their own willingness to be vulnerable and authentic in their relationships. Her journey from emotional isolation to full engagement had apparently given others permission to risk connection rather than settling for superficial safety. But the most significant moment came as the evening was winding down, when Mike found her standing in the exact spot where she'd first encountered him 9 months earlier. The boiler was humming contentedly in the background, having been thoroughly repaired and upgraded through Mike's patient attention to its actual needs rather than attempts to force compliance with ideal standards. "Any regrets about turning down Washington?" Mike asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind while they looked out at their friends and family cleaning up from the celebration. "None," Danica replied without hesitation, recognizing the absolute truth of that statement. "I thought career advancement was the only kind of success that mattered, but it turns out that building a life with people you love is actually much more difficult and much more rewarding than climbing organizational hierarchies, even when those people include an 8-year-old who has opinions about everything and a maintenance worker who talks to mechanical equipment like it has feelings." Mike asked with the gentle humor that had first broken through her emotional barriers. "Especially then," Danica confirmed, turning in his arms to face him directly. "You taught me that the best systems aren't the ones that eliminate all variables. They're the ones that adapt to accommodate the variables that matter." As they stood together in the place where their relationship had begun, surrounded by evidence of the family and community they'd built together, Danica marveled at the journey that had brought her from the ice-cold general who never smiled to someone whose laughter came as naturally as breathing. The transformation felt both miraculous and inevitable, representing everything she'd learned about the difference between existing and actually living. "Ready to go home?" Mike asked, gesturing toward Celia, who was demonstrating proper cleanup techniques to a group of children while simultaneously explaining why wedding cake counted as educational nutrition. "With both of you?" Danica replied, looking at the two people who had taught her that home wasn't a place, but a feeling of belonging that came from being known and loved completely. Always. As they gathered their family and friends for final goodbyes, Danica caught her reflection in the community center's front windows and saw something that would have been unrecognizable to the woman who had first walked through these doors 9 months earlier. Someone who looked genuinely happy, completely loved, and absolutely at peace with a life built on connection rather than control. The ice-cold general who had never smiled had finally learned that the warmest victories were the ones measured in laughter shared, love given freely, and families chosen intentionally. And for the first time in 20 years, General Danica Cuelmont was exactly where she belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.